My Personal Recollections of Thomas Troward by Harry Gaze. Chapter 4. Some Troward Letters. A few letters from Thomas Troward, one to me personally, and a few to Miss Alice Callow and others are given here because they throw a more intimate light on the nature and character of our genial philosopher. In a trunk, bombed in World War I had a number of such precious documents, including some very valued ones from our Higher Thought Secretary, Miss Alice Callow, reviewing my teaching activities at her centre in 1903, a year before the famous Edinburgh Lectures of Mr. Troward. In these she wrote, in the kindest terms, of the help that she and Mr. Troward and others received from my lectures and classes. It was indeed a great satisfaction to have been helpful to those who in later years did so much for humanity. The only letter I find among my present papers is a short note from Mr. Troward telling me that he was personally sending me a copy of the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, asking for a review of his book in my magazine. This magazine was Life Culture, which I published for some time. The letter follows. 38, Lancaster Road, South Norwood, London, 13th June, 1907. Dear Mr. Gaze, I have sent you by today's post a copy of my Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science for favor of review in your new magazine, of which I have just heard from my friend Dr. Cornwall Round. I am glad to say this book is enjoying a fair share of popularity, which a notice in your magazine would no doubt help to increase. I do not know whether you remember my being introduced to you at the Higher Thought Center some time ago. I hope your work is progressing satisfactorily and that your new magazine will be a great success. Yours sincerely, T. Troward. Writing to Miss Callow in 1911, a statement appears which I feel is tremendously important to students of Thomas Troward's teachings throughout the world. After writing his wonderful books and after their astonishing success, he found a new approach to truth for himself, a new outlook, and a new emphasis and sense of proportion. This is the first time that this development in the life of Mr. Troward has been given to the public. This is the momentous letter. I think from your letter that you too begin to feel, as I do, the presence of something greater than a merely intellectual element in the spiritual life. I have no doubt, in due course, we shall find it. I think this great secret is nowhere more fully stated than in the writings of St. John. They are the most helpful books I know, and sometimes I wonder whether it is any use reading or writing others. Now I must end. My wife joins me in all kind thought. Yours very sincerely, T. Troward. Earlier in this letter, Mr. Troward mentioned that some of his books were being advertised in America, although they were copyrighted in his name, but that, anyway, they are making the books known, which should be useful if I should go to America to lecture. It is extremely interesting to know that Thomas Troward at one time contemplated a trip to the United States, an event which, had it been consummated, would have created a great wave of interest among his American followers. Two very concise letters will show how Mr. Troward proposed a healing for a woman who was making considerable difficulty for herself and others because of her fears. Dear Miss Callow, I enclose for your perusal the letter I have received from Mrs. F., together with a copy of my reply. You can return them to me on Wednesday. The whole affair is a tempest in a teacup, and the less notice taken of it the better. With all kind thought, T. Troward. This is the reply sent. Dear Mrs. F., I have carefully considered your letter, and it appears to me that the answer to all the suggestions contained in it is a very short one. Perfect love casteth out fear. He that feareth is not made perfect in love. With all good wishes, T. Troward. Another letter, although perhaps of no great importance, at least gives an intimate view of Thomas Troward, proving Mr. Troward helpful and cooperative in family emergency, and may therefore be quite interesting and give a sidelight on his habit of helpfulness. This letter is also written to Miss Callow, and is as follows, illustrating that the servant problem existed also in his day. We are left without any servants and having to do everything for ourselves, my wife acting as cook and brother as housemaid, while I clean boots and fill the coal scuttles. This necessitates my wife being up to lay all fires which she declares I am incapable of doing. I hope we shall soon get both house and servants." The picture of coal scuttles filled by Mr. Troward and that of his cleaning boots conjures up something quite different from the visualization of the eminent judge usually pictured in America. From my early recollection of English weather in the country, it sounds rather chilly. It was probably only temporary inconvenience, and I like to think of Mr. Troward free from shining the boots of the family, and comfortably busy with his Bible study, his writing of books, and the painting he loved so well. It may be of interest to the reader to find a correspondence between this simple glimpse into the domestic life of Mr. and Mrs. Troward and paragraphs from the chapter entitled The Sacred Name, pages 189 and 190 in Bible Mystery and Bible Meaning. He aptly says, "The true relation of the individual soul to the universal principle could not be more perfectly depicted than by the names Ishi and Hephzibah. We have only to turn to any well-ordered family to see the force of the illustration. The respective spheres of the husband and wife as the heads of such a household are clearly defined. The husband provides the supplies and the wife distributes them. In the household emergency, the Trowards, the husband, provided the coals in the scuttles, and the wife made wise use of the coals by distributing and firing them. And so in the description of the perfect woman, we read that in her mouth is the law of kindness. Hephzibah, the perfect woman, rules her house wisely in love, and so applies the raw material which she can draw from her husband's storehouse without stint, that, by her diligence and understanding, she converts it into all those varied forms of use and beauty which are indicated under the similitudes of domestic provision and merchandise in the 31st chapter of Proverbs. The analogy may not be exact, for analogy is never absolute, but it will be sufficient for my purpose if the very kind reader will realize that for completion it is not only necessary to have the source of supply as representing the divine masculine, but it is also essential that there should be a divine feminine to lay the coals and really fire the heart and hearth with loving warmth for all the family. The conventional idea of God has been too exclusively masculine, particularly in the Protestant religions, and the Catholic religion, through the person of Mary, the Divine Mother, and the Christian Scientists and other metaphysical societies and churches supply this imperative need through emphasis on the divine feminine, principle, or mother God. The pioneers in New Thought activity believed in the law of attraction, attunement with which would bring prosperity. But the channels of work in which they toiled were not of a nature to bring early financial results. They met a critical public, unlearned in the truth, who charged them with commercialism if they made good in regard to money, and who were still more critical if they fell down financially and got into debt. Thomas Troward's family was growing up, and expenses were increasing just as his work ended in India. The government pension was not too large, and the royalties from books had not reached a profitable stage in his lifetime. He tells in his letters to friends that his wife was the optimist of the family, and that her cheerfulness was in contrast to his tendency to worry. He admitted this in saying, "I am a worrier." Today, the continued affirmations of prosperity and constructive work on the part of teachers has brought about a very much more prosperous state of affairs, and few have to meet the problems of the earlier pioneers. Still, it is true in many cases that the work and the ability used in teaching the truth, if employed in the business world, would have brought greater results in the attraction and accumulation of money. It is the sheer love of being of service that has kept many in this work. When Thomas Troward passed from this scene of action, it was first proposed that a fund should be established for the purpose of establishing the Troward Memorial Edition of the late T.T. Troward's works. Mrs. Troward, however, writing to her friends at the Higher Thought Center, happily finds this no longer necessary, and expresses her appreciation of the intention. She comments, "Now there is no necessity to finance the publishing, and the publishers prefer to do so themselves. I suppose the fund will be used in some other way, but I felt I must express my deep gratitude, even though the money will not be used for me. Still, the kind intention was the same, and I think it was a splendid tribute to my dear one's memory, and one which will never be forgotten by me. Thanking you all for the time given and trouble taken over all this." With kindest thought, yours very sincerely, Annie Troward. Here is a most interesting letter written to me recently from Miss Ruth Bradshaw, who was, for many years, Honorary Secretary of the British section of the International New Thought Alliance. London, Northwest 8. Dear Dr. Gaze, thank you very much for your letter. Yes, I remember that you knew Mr. Thomas Troward when he was quite unknown to fame. That, of course, would add special value to your reminiscences. I have written to Miss L.G., as she is the only one I know of here who knew Mr. T personally. She was a devoted student. She told me how, when the First World War broke out, the students relied so much on his spiritual support. He and Canon Wilberforce were great friends. She told me how, one day, when Mr. T was taking the chair for Canon W., he spoke of Canon W. as a great man. The Canon then said, "No, Mr. Troward is the great man," and they went on praising each other. Canon W. died during the war. The students, grieved at the news, said, "Anyway, we have Mr. Troward with us." The next news they heard was that Mr. T had died. I believe the two men died within a day of each other. Mr. T was apparently quite well, but said he felt cold and lay down on the hearthstone in front of the fire to warm himself. A little later, when some member of the family or household took a look at him, it was found that he was gone. A letter sent by Thomas Troward to Miss Gear, his student, is interesting, especially from the standpoint of mutual help between student and teacher. At a time when he felt the keen need of spiritual help, he found her message to him comforting and healing. The Troward letter is written 7 years after the publication of the Edinburgh Lectures, 19th of September, 1911. Dear Miss Gear, just a few lines to thank you for your most kind letter and to tell you how much strength and encouragement such a letter gives me, coming as it does at a time when I am much in need of such help. I am indeed glad that anything I have said or written has been of assistance to you, and if you owe me anything, your letter has amply repaid it. Dr. James Porter Mills wrote a book called Health. Later he added a chapter and called the new edition From Existence to Life. Dr. Mills gave a copy of Health to Mr. Troward in 1908. On the cover of From Existence to Life is printed the following: My feeling is that From Existence to Life is by far the best book yet published on advanced psychology and spiritual healing. It is clear, fresh, sane, and self-evidently practical, both in its psychological and spiritual teaching. From a letter from Judge T. Troward to the author. Ruth Troward paid a visit to Lancaster Gate, British section of the INTA, in 1932 or 1933. She was very nice and very good-looking, with long, straight features. She was paying a short visit to England and then returning to France, where she lived at that time. It was Miss Callow who, at the Higher Thought Center, helped Mr. Troward write the books. I have a letter from Miss Beatrice Hope, Assistant Secretary at the Higher Thought Center, dated 1944. In it, she says, the work of the Higher Thought Center was purely foundational, going on quietly, attending to its affairs, while many new elements were springing up around. Mr. Troward, speaking each Sunday morning during our tenancy of the Doré Gallery, was always declaring, in the beginning, God. Mr. and Mrs. Hurd, for many years Honorary Secretary of the INTA, were very friendly with Mr. Troward, and he was often invited to their home. In 1958, I had the joy of still one more of my trips to my native country, this time to meet members of the Troward family and to supplement this biography with such details of their father's life that they could give. They were most kind and cooperative and tried their best to recall incidents and events in his life and glimpses of his life in India. Their youth in those days, their absences in boarding school, and other factors made these somewhat few. I am grateful, however, for some interesting details from his daughter Ruth and his son Rupert. From Rupert I gained a wonderfully illuminating and touching letter from his father and some interesting pictures. Rupert's wife, I found, was a cheery and vital 81, and Rupert only a few years younger, and looked a most remarkable duplicate of his father in appearance. Among the many interesting places in which the Troward family lived was a flower-covered cottage at Ruan Minor in picturesque Cornwall. The name of the cottage was Carleon. I found a very lovely painting of this cottage on a wall in Rupert's London flat and learned that it was painted by his father. I am indebted to him for a photograph of this painting. Mr. Thomas Troward came naturally to law and his practice as a judge, his grandfather being a lawyer. He was the son of Albany and Frederica Troward. The father was born in the county of Middlesex in 1799. The son, Thomas, was twice married. I am happy to have an excellent portrait of him and his family. Ruth says, in answer to my question of her father's experiences and success in healing, I am afraid I know nothing in either direction, and can remember his dislike of a tendency in some students, especially by novices, to use thought to bring about material good in themselves, rather than spiritual. I remember him quoting with regard to this, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you." These words, I think, summed up his own attitude very definitely. As a family, we enjoyed good health, so he can have had little need to seek and to exercise any healing power he may have had, while we lived at home. But it is, of course, also possible that he was able to help friends or strangers by letters and prayer. This was undoubtedly the case, and while not a professional practitioner, Mr. Troward frequently helped those in need. Mrs. Hurd reported that Ruth told her of great personal help in solving problems and being able to demonstrate opportunities to others. A man who was a stranger asked her if she saw anything peculiar about his face. He said, "Come close to the light and examine it thoroughly." She did so, and said she saw nothing peculiar with it. He then said that some time back he had lupus, and his doctor told him that he could not live more than 2 months. He then decided that he might as well spend his last days in some pleasant place, and chose Italy. A friend saw him off at the railway station, and just before the train left, slipped a book into his overcoat pocket and said, "This may help pass the time on your journey and may interest you." The man read the book on the journey and was enthralled by it. He said to himself, "If this is true, I will prove it." He did, with the happy result described. The name of the book was The Creative Process in the Individual by Thomas Troward. When I got in further touch with Miss Ruth Troward, she wrote as follows, "I shall be very interested to meet you and hear more about the biography. If I can contribute any fresh information for it, I will, of course, gladly do so. But I must point out that, owing to a variety of circumstances, I knew far too little of my father and his work, and also of his much earlier life, of which he spoke very little. This makes his biography somewhat difficult to write, as a keen student of his books, who made a brave attempt, discovered. But she had not known my father personally, as you had, and this makes a world of difference. I am afraid you will find me but a poor kind of daughter for so eminent a father, but I will do my best." Here is one of Miss Troward's communications to me, giving some intimate family details of the life of Thomas Troward and a pleasant insight into his character and happy relationship with his family. You will know that he delved deep into various Indian and other Eastern religions in those years in India. One rather strange memory comes to me as I write, namely that my father could not be interested in Shakespeare. "I'd sooner read the Arabian Nights," he said once or twice to me. He valued Emerson very highly. The first memory of my father was at the age of 3, when he and my mother sometimes took me to the end of the long grey stone cob at Lyme Regis. My father then set up a small easel and seated himself on a webbed stool that opened out mysteriously from what appeared to me to be a short, broad stick. He would then begin to paint a picture of sea and boats, which I thought him very wonderful to be able to do. On his last furlough from India in 1892, which he spent with his whole family in Cornwall at Padstow, he revealed a gift for the telling of fascinating adventures of children with fairies, giants, and magicians, thrilling without being too alarming. Walks with our father became very popular. When settled in the pretty house at Tunbridge Wells, Father introduced the custom of family prayers before we sat down to breakfast. We children knelt at one side of the huge dining table, and the parents each at their big armchairs on either side of the fireplace. The family cat, still young and skittish, formed a habit of mounting on my father's shoulders as soon as he knelt at his chair, after having read some verses from the Bible. For some months Father endured this patiently, being extremely fond of cats. But at last Sooty forgot his manners, and suddenly, attracted by Father's spectacles, pushed them off with a skillful paw. This new game continued for a few days, but finally, as Sooty grew more of an adept at the game, and one day tossed the spectacles into the fireplace, the limit had been reached, and Father rose up from his knees, and with deliberation removed a soft house slipper from his foot, applied it gently but firmly to Sooty's behind, and compelled him out through the French windows. We young people collapsed into helpless laughter, and Father, returning to his armchair, suddenly joined in, saying, "I give it up. We cannot possibly continue with these prayers." And indeed, they were never continued. With regard to cats, Father sometimes enjoyed startling Mother if she was absorbed in some book or work near a mealtime by suddenly putting his head round the door and meowing as loudly as any cat pleading for food, and then quietly chuckling at his success in making Mother jump. I well remember my first introduction at 12 years old to the idea of reincarnation. It was on a windy autumn afternoon. My sister and I had been taken for a walk by Father, and the talk had somehow turned upon the subject of death, to be followed by heaven or hell, in which teaching I had been brought up in a small free church before my parents left India. My father recited quietly that it was far more probable that no such startlingly sudden change would take place, and that he believed it possible we had already lived on earth before and might do so again. Also that there were surely many other worlds to be experienced in the course of eternity, and each and all held within the love of God. This appeared to me to be simply true, and the belief accepted by me then has accompanied me throughout a long life, thanks to this Sunday afternoon walk and talk. My father was nearsighted and found difficulty when out walking to recognize faces. We children often tried this out with success, but my mother achieved a success that outshone all our own. She was returning from a visit and was wearing a new spring costume and hat. Near the house she met a friend and stopped for a brief chat with her. Seeing Father emerge from our garden just then, bound for the postbox at the other end of the road, she begged the friend in a whisper not to call Father's attention to her, as she wished to play a joke on him if possible. The friend agreed, and as Father came nearer, she called out a greeting, and he stopped and embarked on a little talk with her. She did not, of course, introduce my mother, and Father, lifting his cap to both, resumed his way with his letters. At lunch, my mother asked if he had been out at all that morning, and he told her that he had been to the postbox and back, and had met their friend, Mrs. X, on the way. He added that she had had some lady, unknown to him, with her, and he had been surprised that she had not been introduced to him, and thought it a little lacking in politeness to both this lady and himself. When Mother told him the strange lady's name, he fell into one of his silent fits of laughter, literally laughing till he cried. Another mistake due to Father's nearsightedness occurred not long after. There had been a very sad accident at our house, when a window cleaner had fallen, and was so seriously injured that he died later in a hospital. He had worked for us for some years, and Father had been very grieved and had done all in his power to help. Fortunately, the man was unmarried and had no near relatives, so Father arranged everything for the funeral with a local undertaker. At this particular time, he was engaged in the private publication of his first book, for which he had not turned to any publishing firm. He had found a competent printer and binder in Norwood for the job. One day, soon after the window cleaner's funeral, he met a man in our road who greeted him politely, and believing him to be the printer, Father remarked in a cheerful voice, "I'm so glad to see you, and I hope to have a lot more work to give you before long." The man stared at him in surprise and then said, "Excuse me, sir, but I think you must be mistaking me for someone else. I'm the undertaker who arranged the funeral for you the week before last." Footnote. Rupert Troward tells the story somewhat differently, adding, "As Potter used to say, the fellow must have thought I was going into wholesale murder." The 1914 war had just begun, and we were still in Cornwall. On one of the war's earliest days, Father set out with all his usual painting gear and the ancient webbed stool of the Lyme Regis days, and was soon walking with his quick springy step across the firm sands of a wide bay, at whose far side he intended sketching. He had entirely forgotten the war's new and sudden restrictions. Sitting on a cliff above the bay, we watched the scene. A coast guard had noticed Father's rapidly moving figure and load, and had set off in pursuit. But to overtake Father was no easy task. The coast guard shouted, but Father, absorbed in his own thoughts and plan, paid no attention, and did not even turn his head. It was only at the farthest limit of the wide bay that the pursuer caught up with his prey, and then recognized the familiar face of my father, whom he had suspected as a possible spy, setting out to make forbidden drawings of the coast. Father was very surprised that his beloved sketching could no longer be freely indulged along the coast. My father was possessed of a good sense of humor, and when this came uppermost, he would break into a soundless kind of laughter, his shoulders shaking and tears of mirth trickling from his eyes. He was an adept at making puns, and never missed any opportunity for doing so. He was so happily constituted as to be able to enjoy the good things of life in moderation, but also to enjoy their absence equally. if absorbed in any special work, and particularly when out painting. I remember him, for instance, often starting out for a day's sketching with all the essential equipment, and as his sole sustenance a small bar of plain chocolate and a little drinking water. He rarely allowed sandwiches to be prepared for him. I believe he never turned in anywhere for other food or drink, and his way led him mostly to remote parts of the shore with little or no opportunity for other refreshment, even had he desired it. At table he sometimes made use of a little phrase which amused us as children. If passing anything required across our big dining table, he first carefully removed any article that might obstruct a clear passage, saying, when Mother laughed at this, "Two solid bodies cannot occupy the same space at the same moment in time, my dear." This table philosophy remains in my mind to this day. It has its good uses. He took great pleasure in any little success enjoyed by his children, in their school life or later on, and though seldom demonstrative, valued little signs of affection. I believe he never refused an alms to anyone who came to him in need. "Give to him that asketh of you" was for him a word to be obeyed very literally. As I look back, I believe that he may have had a premonition of his death, since in April of that year, 1916, he did a thing unusual for him to do. I was leaving our house at Shiplake that day to return to my teaching in Sussex, when he called me into his study and placed his hands on my shoulders and then spoke some very affectionate words to me, indicating that he had found me a good and helpful daughter to himself and my mother. I was both surprised and touched, feeling little worthy of this appreciation. Many have longed for a simple, condensed expression of Thomas Troward's spiritual philosophy. They have especially desired one that could be applied to the most difficult as well as the simple conditions of life by a beginner. I am able to present just such a statement of truth written to his son Rupert in 1915 when he was called to World War I, and 1 year before the passing of Mr. Troward. It will serve to cover a vast number of problems besides war. I am sure that this affectionate missive to his son will be closely studied by every lover of Thomas Troward. Here it is. St. Kevern, Lower Shiplake, Oxon, 21st April, 1915. My very dear son, I have heard this morning that you have been passed by the doctor and are likely to go to the front. Now may the Lord go with you, dear Rupert, and bring you back safe and sound. Put your whole trust in him and fear not. Remember the promise in the 91st Psalm. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. And the reason is given in the same psalm, because thou hast made the Lord, even the Most High, thy habitation. And he that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. This does not mean making long prayers, for Christ said, Ye shall not be heard for your much speaking. But what it does mean is a constant dwelling in thought upon the continual presence of God with us and around us. It is a sort of constant conversation with God in our heart, nothing too good for him to do for us, and nothing of ours too small for him to take notice of it. Remember Christ's words, the kingdom of heaven is within you. First find God in yourself, and you will find him everywhere else. Your daily prayer should therefore be simply this: let me find thee this day in myself, and then go forward in the full confidence that this prayer has been answered. This is not vain repetition, but the highest operation of the law of cause and effect. There is sound reason for it when we come to analyze it, but it is not necessary for its working that we should understand how it works, any more than it is necessary for us to understand all the theory of electricity in order to ring an electric bell. It is a case of you press the button and we do the rest, as the ad says. Footnote, an advertising slogan of the Kodak Company. So you, my boy, just do what the old governor says and let your daily prayer to God be, cause me to find thee in myself this day. And you will be surprised to find how wonderfully it works. The proof of the pudding is the eating of it. I am now 68 years old, nearly the proverbial 70 years of full human life. Yet I feel nearly as young, or I may say quite so, as when I was 25, and in heart and mind a great deal younger, and I can only put it down to what I have now told you. And as the result of all my studies, I find just 2 books really worth study: the Book of God, which is the Bible, and the Book of Nature. In the one, God reveals himself as the life-giving spirit, and in the other as the life-giving energy. And the 2 are one, and each of these 2 books of God helps to throw light upon the other. God is eternal light, which is eternal life, and the more we realize that we ourselves are made of this eternal light, both in soul and body, the more we shall find God as a continual source of light and life in ourselves. This is why Jesus said, "The water that I shall give him shall become in him a well of water springing up unto eternal life." Well, my dear boy, carry these thoughts with you wherever you go, whether in war or in peace, and you will find they will grow in you and expand beyond the short statement I have made in this letter, and they will become a constant source of help to you at all times. Now, I am sure you will be amused to hear from whom I received a request for a copy of Bible Mystery yesterday, of all people, from the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Chicago. Fancy his wanting a book written by such an ultra-heretic as me. I hope he will like it when he gets it. The Roman Catholics are perfectly sincere and earnest in their religion. Now, my dear boy, is there anything else we can do for you or get for you before you go? If so, let us know. I do hope we shall be able to see you again before you go. I shall be in London for the weekend and could come to tea either Saturday or Sunday if you can get away on either of those days. I shall leave here on Saturday morning by the 11 o'clock train and go to lunch at Mrs. Peterson's at Hampstead. Then I could come to tea, and then I go to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Derrick at 3 Drayton Gardens, South Kensington, at which address letters will find me on Saturday evening and Monday morning. They are quite new acquaintances who have kindly asked me to put up with them. We should all like to see you before you go, if it can be arranged, but I suppose you are unlikely to get long enough leave for that. We all send you our love, and most of all myself, your affectionate Pater. God be with you till we meet again. In the joy of the Lord is your strength. I'm sure this letter will be of help to many with urgent problems, and the simple ones as well, which often loom up large in human thought and imagination. Troward lived in Ramsitsar in the Punjab, the north of India, just below the immense mountain ranges called the Himalayan Mountains, forming a terrific barrier between them and the Soviet and other regions beyond. One can hardly realize the density of the population there and the abject poverty of hordes of people, together with the fantastic wealth of the few, especially in Troward's day. Such conditions required a Solomon to straighten out difficulties. In Ruth's father, multitudes had found such a one, kind though judicial. The mountains were often brilliant with the varied light of sunshine and shadow, heights and vast valleys, the golden and flaming colors of dawn and sunrise, and again, the rich purples at the close of day. Indeed, Troward could exclaim, "I look to the hills and ask, whence cometh my help?" The answer was always ready for him. My help cometh from the Lord. Despite the legal tangles to be straightened out and the confusion about him, he had penetrating insight into the Old Testament. The Psalms and the Raja Yoga, the royal yoga of India, gave him poise and power. It could be said of Thomas Troward, as it was said of the preacher in Oliver Goldsmith's deserted village, like some tall cliff that lifts its noble form, swells from the vale, and midway leaves the storm. Though at its base the rolling clouds are spread, eternal sunshine settles on its head. Footnote: for an interesting article on Ruan Minor and Carleon Cottage, see New Light on Thomas Troward, Journal 7, 1992, page 33 to 41, London, The Thomas Troward Society.